hello. This is a topic that I've wanted to talk about for quite some time now, and it stemmed from me just reading an article by, I think, the Cato Institute on this topic, and I'll link that in the description. And the topic is the gender pay gap, or the so-called gender pay gap. And the article was entitled "The Myth of the Gender Pay Gap," and I think that's what I'm going to entitle this video. And it spurred me on to read some reports from official government statistics in the UK, because this article was from the US, and the same trend was essentially evident in both the UK and the US. So essentially, what the goal is here, I'm going to read through the statistics, but I deem the main statistics to be the most indicative ones, and of course, I'm going to link all papers that I've read from below, so that you can do it for yourself and find out, basically, if I'm telling the truth. So yeah, I'm obviously I'll be reading from the screen quite a lot. So if you see it's looking up or like my hand scrolling, that's what that is. But it's because I want to be as accurate as possible, and I want to actually get to the heart of what is true, what is known, and what's not known or less true, or is being spun in the media and by various activists. So yeah, the first part of the video, we're going to look at the gender pay gap, what it actually is, what the reasons for it actually are, and then we're going to look at some other evidence of inequality in the workplace and how it might actually be contrary to popular belief. So yeah, that's where we'll start. So just to begin with, the headline figure is, as of April 2025, was 6.9%, meaning males are paid 6.9% more when in the same field as a female. That does not mean that they're paid more for the same role, because of course, due to legislation like the Equality Act in 2010 and other legislation, that is illegal. So it's not saying that for the exact same amount of work, for the exact same role, men are being paid more than women. It's just showing that in the same field, so law potentially, I don't know, just as an example, if you're a paralegal or a clerk or like a secretary, your class has been in the same field as someone who is a practicing lawyer, and obviously there's a massive difference in responsibility. So there's also a commensurate difference in pay. So that's what it means. And this is just the introduction, by the way. What the report also says is the pay gap is larger for employees aged 40 years and over. And as we'll see, there's actually, it would actually be better quantified as an age gap rather than a gender pay gap, an age pay gap, because as you see, it never goes in the other direction. It always is positively correlated with age, meaning the more you get paid, the likelihood is the older you are, and equally, the more you get paid, the larger the discrepancy in the so-called gender pay gap. So that's important. It's obviously higher among higher paid employees and lower among lower paid employees, because obviously there's more, the ability for there to be such a difference is bigger. Obviously, if you're both cleaners, it's a lot more difficult to massively ascend, and like you might get paid a little bit more for seniority, but you're not gonna, the difference isn't going to be of the same scale as if you're both, I don't know, both high ranking in an office or so. I can't think off the top of my head, sorry. But yeah, obviously the higher up you go in terms of pay scale, the higher the gap, or at least the ability for some sort of gap to show will be. And obviously it's the average is median hourly earnings average. And it's a measure across all jobs in the UK, and they specify this themselves. It's not of the difference in pay between men and women for doing the same job. They actually specify this in the report. So now to get on to the actual fun stuff. So the pay gap for 2025 for full-time employees was £20.27 for men, and the average pay for women was £18.87. So it's a difference of about £1.50. I don't know if that's right. I hope. And so, what does the report say? The report. This is really key to understanding what this actually means. Obviously, the full-time gender pay gap was the one that I just talked about, the £20.27 for the 1887. It actually goes in the opposite direction for part-time employees. So for males, the average pay for part-time employees is £13.85 an hour. For females, it's £14.25 an hour. So in this particular instance, and we'll see why in a minute that is, because it's the same reason that the so-called gender pay gap goes in the opposite direction for full-time employees. In this instance, females are actually paid more than males on average. And it is notable that from the previous year, it's actually went down. It's went down from 7.1% to 6.9%. Obviously, that's the headline figure for the full-time employees. And yeah, again, they specify that the difference is not a measure of difference in pay between men and women in the same employment and with similar skills and experience. So that's key, experience and skills. And it does not take skills, experience, or differences in character into account. So already there's kind of hints at why this may occur, this so-called gender pay gap. It seems fairly obvious on the face of it why this may occur. It's because of experience. It's because of seniority level. And this is borne out, as we'll soon see. But just as a general rule of thumb, right? Let's think about this. If you're spending, on average, because not all females do get pregnant, but on average, if you're spending 3 years out of the workplace more by the time you're aged 40 to your male counterparts, do you think that's going to have an impact on your seniority level, experience, and the skills that you've been able to acquire? Even if you've worked in the same fields and then you've continued working, obviously apart from the maternity leave and stuff like that, of course it will, because 3 years out of employment, obviously it's not all in one go usually, but 3 years out of employment is massive. That's a massive difference, and that's the same reason why you see in part-time employment, females are actually getting paid more. It's not because there's some bias towards females, some institutional systemic bias that then reverses when you look at full-time employment. No, it's because the kinds of people that work part-time employment for females tend to be older. They tend to be people who have returned to employment from full-time employment, whereas part-time employees who are male tend to be younger. It tends to be the first job, so they're less senior and they've been able to acquire less skills and less experience. That's why you see it go in opposite directions for part-time and full-time employment. And if the hypothesis of a patriarchal society and systemic bias towards males was true, you wouldn't expect to see that for part-time employees. You would expect the same direction of the effect for part-time and full-time employees. So the gender pay gap was negative for part-time employees, so 2.9%. By negative, they just mean that it didn't go in the direction of males being paid more. So their baseline assumption is that males are paid more, generally speaking. One of the reasons for this that they give is that there are more part-time employees who are women. And this is the case for both. Approximately 85% of men were working full-time compared to 61% of women. And yeah, so this is where you really get to the idea that, skills and experience and character are the main things, and it's not actually institutional bias in favour of males. The gender pay gap for full-time employees is largest among the highest earners and smallest among the lowest earners. So the gender pay gap among employees in the 90th percentile, those who earn more than 90% of employees, but less than the remaining 10%, was 15.2%. For those in the 50th percentile, it was obviously 6.9%. That's where the average comes from. And for those earning more than the 10%, but obviously in the 10th percentile, it was 1.8%. So you're almost seeing parity here between those who are earning nothing, and that's because experience and skill is really important. In that, the more skilled you are, it's sort of a compounding effect. The more skilled you are, the more able you are to upskill and go for those higher paying roles, and even higher paying roles, and progress. It's harder to progress at the start of your employment journey than it is when you're, say, 40 and you've spent 20 years in employment, because you've gained more skills, you've gained more experience. So there's sort of that compounding effect. So you see the gender pay gap is highest among the professions, or the skilled trades. So skilled trade occupations is 13.9%. Associate professional and technical occupations is 12.5%. And process plant and machine operatives, it's 12.3%. Now this makes sense because it's very hard to equalize those differences in experience. Like I said before, there's that compounding effect as you get older, and so there's a massive difference between women who have spent 3 years out of the workforce who haven't been able to progress at the same rate in those professions or skilled trades where progression is inherent to it. That's not necessarily as inherent to other occupations, like, for example, cleaning. There's less scope to progress, so the effect of experience is going to be less. And so, yeah, this is borne out by the data. So when you look at full-time employees aged, sorry, yes, when you look at full-time employees aged 22 to 29, the pay gap is the lowest. It's at 0.9%. For those aged 30 to 39, it's 3.9%. For those aged 40 to 49, it's 9.1%. For those aged 50 to 59, it's 12.5%. And for those aged 60 above, it's 12.6%. So as you say, it never goes in the other direction. It's always, the older you get, the greater the difference between men and women is. And that's because experience level and taking 3 years on average out of the workforce by the age of 40 has had a much greater effect, because that amount of upskilling, the amount of progression that you can do in a period of a few years, and obviously this is average, and not all women have babies, but equally, a lot of women have a lot of babies. So when they're returning, they're basically at the same level of like a 20-year-old who's also just starting. They haven't really had that career progression, and that's fine, but that's not evidence of a systemic oppression of females that people would like you to think it is. So the proportion of women in high-paying occupations, those where pay increases with age and experience decreases with age. So as people get older, males and females of the same age, as they both get older, the representation of women in those higher paying occupations actually decreases. So when you get to, say, 60, for example, the likelihood of seeing a female at the upper echelon, so like as a CEO or a director or someone who's very, very high up, it's a lot less. And I mean, the feminists might say, well, yeah, but that's because systematic oppression of women. But then I would go back to the part-time statistic and say, well, is that not also evidence of systematic oppression of men? Surely you wouldn't expect to say that's difference then. And I think this is where the feminist hypothesis falls down. Because even the ONS here themselves report that where pay increases with age and experience, females are less represented. And yeah, like they've also said, it's also in these occupational groups where median hourly earnings increase more substantially with age. So there's that compounding effect. And I've highlighted a few of the statistics that they offer. So 52% of employees in professional occupations aged 22 to 29 were women. So it's actually, at the younger age group, where if there was this barrier entry that was restricting women, you wouldn't expect to see this. But at the younger age group, women are actually massively overrepresented. That's over half of employees in professional occupations aged 22 to 29 are women. And then this decreases with age. So by 50 to 59, only 42.7% of professional employees were women. That's not even taking into account the idea that most of them are like CEOs. That's just saying most of the people in these professions are no longer women because they've dropped out. And yeah, so they refer again to the wage gap difference by age, but we've already kind of went through the percentage difference. I'm not going to bore you with the actual pound difference. If you do want to find that, you can have a look. And there's other things that the ONS highlight that we're not going to really talk about here, because my main interest here is just in dismantling the feminist hypothesis that it's because of male oppression of females. So London and South East were the regions with the largest gender pay gap, because they've got a higher proportion of employees earning the highest wages. The largest gender pay gaps are in the top paying occupations. So they keep coming back to this idea that it's because of the difference in occupation, occupational level. It's the same occupation, but occupational level. And a few things that they've also highlighted is that women are more likely than men to accept lower pay in favour of a shorter commute. And this is referred to as the commuting gap. Men are more enthusiastic or, more willing to actually travel out of the way for work if it means that they gain a higher pay, while women on average are less willing to do that. So that's also one of these things that influence it. It's the willingness to actually travel. Yeah, and they're more likely to leave the jobs over a longer commute as well. So it's not just that they're less likely to accept those jobs. When they do accept them, they spend less time in them. And this can affect the number of women moving into managerial positions and therefore lead to an increase in the gender pay gap in those regions. Because obviously, if you're looking at the southeast and London, people are commuting to London. They come commuting out from outside of London and even greater London, like different boroughs. They're commuting a greater distance. So, and if you think if that's where most of the managerial positions or high-ranking positions are like gathered, then you would expect that, if women are less willing to commute to those places, they're going to be less likely to get those managerial positions. And so I think, so that's it for the gender pay gap. What I'm going to move on to now is also just like looking at some other statistics around the workplace, and sort of qualitative differences in the work that men and women do, not just the pay differences and why that is. So here I have the report from the Health and Safety Executive, and this was published in 2025. And it goes through workplace injuries basically, and the likelihood of workplace injury for males and females. So I just thought I'd talk through the definition of work-related illness and work-related injury, because this is important. So they define work-related illness as people who have conditions which they think have been caused or made worse by their current or past work. Workplace injuries sustained as a result of a non-road traffic incident. So there you're seeing the difference. So someone's potentially attributing some illness that they've had, that they're not sure has happened at work or not. So you might have got a cold from Deborah, who you work with. You might not have. It might just be flu season. Either way, you've attributed it to the workplace. Workplace injuries inherently are less ambiguous because if you've tripped over at work, or you've, boxes fell on you or something like that, that's a lot less ambiguous. You know that that's happened at work. You can kind of verify that in a better way. So that's just important to bear in mind, because when we look at the statistics around that, you do see a difference. You do see actually females are more likely to experience what they refer to as workplace ill health, and less likely to experience what they refer to as workplace injury. And part of that is potentially, as you'll soon see, because of the self-report nature of it. I mean, both of these things are self-report, but when you have one that's inherently ambiguous, the likelihood that people are going to be incorrect, or it's going to be more difficult to verify, is a lot greater. So the statistics: 829,000 male workers and 962,000 female workers suffered from work-related ill health. So, there's a greater proportion of women that suffer from ill health, work-related. But again, like we said, considering these statistical, the way that the statistics are collected, it's important to bear in mind that, well, they might have a greater incentive. Males might be less likely, for example, to go, oh, I've got that cold. Oh, it's probably from work. They're probably just going to, they're going to be less interested in it. But the breakdown is, among workplace ill health, stress, depression, or anxiety constitute 56% of the cases, while for males, it only constitutes 42%. Musculoskeletal disorders are 34% for males and 24% for females, and other, so just any other ill health, it's 24% for males, 20% for females. This is important because among the workplace illness that would be a bit easier to verify, for males it would be 54%, whereas for females it would only be 44%. So you're seeing that among these workplace illnesses that are a bit easier to verify because they're not psychological, male reported workplace illness is 54%, while female is 44%. So psychological illnesses that are perceived to have happened at work comprise a much larger percent of the female workplace reported illnesses, 56%, while 42% for males. And this is kind of borne out by the fact that females on average, are more prone to negative emotion. They're more neurotic. They tend to be more prone to seeing things negatively, which obviously has benefits, but it also has its drawbacks. And so at work, if people are perceiving that to be a negative work environment, that's more likely to be reported by females, which could explain why females with workplace illness tend to report greater mental illness than males. And among the rest of workplace illness, like the sort of physical illness, females still report far less, even though the overall reported illness is far more, because of, again, the greater proportion of psychological illness that they report. And when we look at fatal injuries, 118 fatal injuries occurred towards males in 2024 to 2025, and only 6 for females. So, I mean, I haven't done the percentages off my head, but if you look at that, it's got to be upwards of 80%. More males are suffering workplace fatalities by a lot. Like pretty much all of them are males. So when you're looking at these more easily verifiable instances of inequality, it's the males who are suffering, not females. And when we look at non-fatal injuries, so not illness, but injuries, which again is a bit more easy to verify, you see 348,000 male workers to 275,000 female workers experience non-fatal injuries. So males are experiencing more non-fatal injuries than females. And again, like, I mean, in absolute terms, I think there's actually more females in the workplace than males. So I think as a proportion, it would be a much greater proportion of males experiencing these non-fatal injuries than females. And yeah, so sorry, we've already been over that. Okay, so for musculoskeletal disorders, which again, 34% of males, 34% of male illness was reported, 278,000 male workers, whereas 234,000 female workers reported this. So, as both an absolute number and a percentage, there's greater numbers of males suffering these more verifiable illnesses. So, 34% for ill health reported by male workers, where it's only 24% of work related ill health for female workers. And yeah, so obviously, there's the massive difference in reporting of mental illness. So it's 350,000 males, and that's 42% of the cases, and it's 536,000 females, and that is 56% of the cases. So that's what we went through before. And obviously, again, the reason for that is most likely because females are a bit more prone to negative emotion. And so now, this is quite a shocking statistic. Of the 13,000 total estimated annual deaths at work due to exposure to various things at work, 75% are male and 25% are female. So when you're looking actually at workplace fatalities, there's a much greater, like, males are 3 times more likely to die at work than females are, or because of exposure to things at work. And the report themselves explain that because males are exposed to more hazards of things like asbestos, and I'm not even going to try and say that word, respirable crystalline silica, diesel engine exhaust emissions, and shift work are among the things that mean that males are at a greater likelihood of dying because of work or at work. And then when you're looking at non-fatal injuries, 348,000 workers reported sustaining a non-fatal injury as a male, and 22% of those non-fatal injuries resulted in 7 days or more off work, whereas for females, 275,000 sustained a non-fatal injury, and only 19% reported an absence of over 7 days. So when you're looking at workplace injury, men are more likely to experience them by quite a lot, and they're also slightly more likely to stay off work for more than 7 days, but not much more likely. But obviously, you know, it tends to be that if you've suffered a workplace injury, you're not staying off for a week. So I would like to say, well, that statistic would say about maybe 3 days or more. When looking at days lost due to workplace injury, 2.8 million working days or full day equivalents were lost due to workplace injury for males, whereas 1.4 million were lost due to workplace injury for females. So that's what I'm talking about. When you're not looking at a week, because a week's quite an extreme amount, and at the extremes you're not going to see that same difference. When you're looking at actual converted to days lost, females spend half the time off work that males do due to workplace injury. That's a lot. And again, workplace illness is coming back up. There is a difference again in workplace illness between males and females. So 16.1 million working days were lost due to workplace illness for males, whereas 16.6 million were lost due to workplace illness for females. And you're looking again, that's a massive difference between injury and workplace illness for both males and females. So because it's less easy to verify, I think more people are doing it because they're like, oh, I'll just claim I've got a cold or whatever. So it's probably easier to look at workplace injury as an indicator of, you know, the differences in males and females at work. And again, you're saying females are slightly more represented, but not really. When you're talking about days lost, and that's because everyone loves to get a few days off when they can, and they'll wrangle it by saying they've got a cold or whatever. But again, if I was to try and explain the difference, I would probably say, you know, females are probably more likely to claim things like mental illness that are keeping them off work, or social anxiety, which may or may not be true. And so I think that is it. So just as a summary, the gender pay gap doesn't really exist. I mean, it would probably be better characterised as an age-related pay gap. And when there are differences among males and females, age at the very least exacerbates it massively. And I think if you were to apply the feminist hypothesis, again, like we've said, it falls down at any scrutiny really, because when you look at part-time employment, females are actually paid more on average than males. So it's more likely that experience and skill level are going to explain that better. And when you look at workplace injury, with the more difficult things to verify, such as workplace illness, females do tend to be slightly more represented than males. But when you're looking at non-fatal injury and fatal injury at work, and you're looking at days lost because of injury at work, it's a massive difference. Males are massively overrepresented. And I think most people would agree that, because males tend to work in the skilled trades, where you've got more likelihood of this danger occurring. So at the very least, I hope that you come away from this kind of scrutinising your beliefs and thinking, well, it's probably not an institutional bias towards males, and it is a bit more nuanced at the very least. And I think an honest reading of this would say that if you were to consider any gender-based sort of bias, or an actual, it's not a discrimination, or it's not an institutional thing. It's just the fact that men tend to take more risk. But if you were to look at an actual discrepancy that's not well explained by age, and that is borne out as a gender difference or sex difference, I think you would have to fall on it's in favour of females rather than males when you look at it, because males are more likely to participate, willingly of course, in more dangerous occupations and to suffer the negative consequences of that. So yeah, I hope this video helps to clarify a few things from you.